Late autumn settled slowly over the frontier valley, the kind of cold season that crept in quietly before revealing its true cruelty. The tall grasses had already turned brittle and pale, bending under the first thin layers of frost that arrived each morning like a warning. The wind that rolled down from the distant hills carried the scent of snow long before the first flakes ever touched the ground. Settlers who had lived through even one winter here understood what that wind meant. It meant the time was running out. Across the valley, smoke rose from half-finished cabins where families worked from dawn to dusk, racing against the cold. Axes rang through the trees as men split logs and dragged them across frozen soil. Women hauled water, patched roofs with rough boards, and stuffed cracks in the walls with moss and cloth. Children gathered sticks and brush for kindling. Every movement carried the same quiet urgency. Winter here was not a season you simply endured. It was a test of whether you had prepared enough, worked hard enough, and built strong enough to survive. Most settlers followed the same pattern. They cut straight logs, stacked them into 4 solid walls, and sealed the gaps with mud and grass. A simple door faced the morning sun if they were careful, and a stone fireplace was built along the far wall to push smoke out through a narrow chimney. The cabins were not beautiful, but they were familiar. The design had been carried west by generations of pioneers who trusted what they knew. When the snow came, those walls and fires were all that stood between a family and the bitter cold outside. But on the far edge of the valley, near a cluster of rocky hills that most people avoided, one woman was doing something very different. Her name was Margaret Hale, though most of the settlers simply called her Maggie. She had arrived in the valley earlier that summer with little more than a mule, a wagon, and a handful of supplies. Unlike many families who traveled in groups, Maggie had come alone. People noticed that immediately. On the frontier, traveling alone was unusual enough to make neighbors curious and sometimes suspicious. At first, the others assumed she would do what everyone else did. They expected her to pick a flat patch of land near the creek, cut timber from the nearby woods, and start raising a small log cabin before winter arrived. That was the sensible thing to do. It was what every other settler had done. Instead, Maggie drove her wagon past the open meadow, past the creek, where other cabins were beginning to rise, and toward the rocky hillside where the ground rose steeply and unevenly. Few people built homes there. The terrain was difficult, the soil thin, and the shadows from the cliffs made the area colder even in daylight. When the first curious neighbor rode up to see what she was doing, he expected to find the beginning of a cabin foundation, or at least a pile of freshly cut logs. Instead, Maggie stood near the base of a limestone hill, staring at a dark opening in the rock. It was a small cave, half hidden by thorn bushes and loose stones. The entrance was barely tall enough for a person to duck through. From the outside it looked damp, cold, and unwelcoming, the kind of place animals might shelter during storms. The neighbor, a broad-shouldered farmer named Thomas Carter, followed her gaze and frowned. "You planning to clear that brush?" he asked. Maggie nodded slightly. Thomas looked again at the cave entrance, then back at her. "You building a cabin here?" "Something like that," she replied. Her answer sounded strange enough that he laughed, assuming she was joking. But Maggie did laugh with him. Instead, she picked up a shovel leaning against the wagon and began pulling loose stones away from the cave entrance. Thomas watched for a few minutes before shaking his head. "Well," he said finally, "good luck with that." By the end of the week, several settlers had heard about Maggie's strange plan. Word traveled quickly in the valley, especially when someone did something unexpected. The idea that a newcomer might try living in a cave, instead of building a proper cabin, sounded absurd to most of them. Still, curiosity drew people toward the hillside. Now and then someone passing by would stop to see what Maggie was doing. Day after day she worked in front of the cave. She cleared thorn bushes and hauled away rocks that had fallen from the hillside. She shoveled dirt and leveled the ground outside the entrance. When the sun climbed high, she pushed her sleeves up and continued digging, sweat streaking the dust on her arms. Inside the cave, the darkness stretched farther than most people expected. The opening might have been small, but the interior chamber widened several feet beyond the entrance. The ceiling curved upward into a rough arch of stone, and the ground sloped gently downward toward the back. It was not a deep cave, but it was large enough to stand in comfortably once inside. Maggie spent hours exploring its interior with a lantern. She tapped the stone walls, brushed away loose gravel, and studied the shape of the chamber, as if she were measuring something invisible. Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the dry grass while she worked. One afternoon, another settler rode up the hill and dismounted beside her wagon. His name was Daniel Brooks, a carpenter who had helped build several cabins in the valley. He leaned against the wagon wheel, watching Maggie drag a heavy stone away from the entrance. "You planning to seal that thing up?" he asked. "Not exactly." Daniel scratched his beard and glanced toward the dark opening. You know caves stay damp. Cold, too. Colder than the air sometimes. Maggie wiped her hands on her skirt. Not always. Daniel chuckled softly. You might want to think about cutting timber instead. Still time before the snow. She did argue with him. She simply nodded and returned to her work. That response puzzled Daniel more than if she had tried to explain. Most settlers loved to talk about their building plans. They debated chimney designs, roof angles, and wall thickness as if those choices could decide life or death during winter. But Maggie rarely explained what she was doing. Instead, she kept working. By mid-October, the valley had grown busier with preparation. Wagons creaked under loads of firewood. Smoke drifted from chimneys where people tested their fireplaces for the first time. The scent of freshly cut pine filled the air. Everywhere except the rocky hillside. There, Maggie continued clearing the cave entrance. She stacked stones into rough piles and hauled buckets of dirt away from the opening. Slowly, the dark mouth of the cave widened enough for a person to walk inside without crouching. From a distance, it still looked like nothing more than a hole in the hillside. But inside, Maggie had begun making changes. She leveled the floor with packed earth, filling low spots with gravel from the creek. She dragged flat stones into place to create a smoother walking surface. Near the back wall, she arranged larger rocks into a curved barrier that resembled the beginnings of a hearth. When the wind outside grew sharp with cold, the cave interior remained strangely still. It held a quiet warmth that surprised her the first time she noticed it. During one frosty morning, she stepped inside from the biting air outside and paused, realizing the temperature felt softer within the stone walls. Not warm exactly, but steadier, less harsh. She stood there for a moment, lantern glowing faintly in the dim chamber. The earth had a way of holding its own climate. Outside, the valley continued buzzing with activity. Logs were stacked into tall cabin walls. Roof beams creaked into place. Families rushed to finish construction before the ground froze too hard for digging. Whenever someone mentioned Maggie, the reactions were usually the same: confusion, amusement, sometimes concern. At the small trading post near the creek, settlers often gathered in the evenings to exchange news and supplies. Conversations drifted easily from crops to livestock to the coming winter. And more than once, someone brought up the woman living by the cave. You see what she's doing up there? One farmer asked one evening. Turning that cave into her house. Another replied with a grin. A few people laughed. One tea lasts through December, someone said. Not unless she plans to hibernate. The laughter one's tea cruel, exactly. Frontier life had a way of making people blunt. Everyone understood how dangerous winter could be, and anything that looked like poor planning seemed almost unbelievable. Meanwhile, Maggie continued her quiet work on the hillside. She rarely visited the trading post and spoke little to neighbors unless necessary. Most evenings she stayed near the cave, cooking simple meals over a small fire outside while the sky darkened over the valley. At night, coyotes called from distant ridges. The stars above the hills burned bright and cold, and the cave waited beside her like a secret most people did. To understand. What the neighbors saw looked foolish. A woman spending precious autumn weeks digging around a cave instead of raising walls. But Maggie was not acting without reason. Years earlier, long before she reached this valley, she had traveled through mountain country, where miners and trappers sometimes used natural caves as shelter during brutal winters. She had seen how deep earth stayed insulated from the wild swings of weather above. Snow might pile high outside, while the stone chambers beneath remained strangely stable. Cool in summer, mild in winter. The memory of that quiet warmth had never left her. When she first discovered the cave in the hillside, something in her mind clicked into place. While others saw a dark hole in the rock, Maggie saw thick natural walls, wind protection, and a roof that would never leak. Most importantly, she saw insulation. The earth itself could hold heat far better than wooden planks. Of course, the cave ones, perfect. It needed work. The entrance was too open, allowing cold air to drift inside. Loose stones cluttered the floor. Rainwater sometimes trickled along one wall after heavy storms. But those were problems she believed she could solve, and so she kept working. Every morning the sound of her shovel echoed faintly against the stone walls while the valley prepared for winter in its own familiar way. Some neighbors still rode past the hillside out of curiosity. They watched Maggie haul buckets of gravel or drag branches toward the cave entrance. Each time they left with the same puzzled shake of the head. To them, the idea still sounded strange. A cave was something animals used, not people. Yet as the days shortened and frost thickened across the valley, Maggie remained calm. While others worried about finishing cabins before the first snow, she studied the cave walls with quiet confidence. Because to her, the cave was not a desperate shelter. It was the beginning of something far more powerful than the settlers realized. a natural bunker carved by the earth itself. And though the neighbors laughed now, the coming winter would soon reveal whether Maggie Hale was foolish or far wiser than anyone had guessed. By the time the last golden leaves began to fall from the cottonwood trees along the creek, nearly everyone in the valley had heard about Maggie Hale and her strange project on the rocky hillside. What had started as a quiet curiosity was slowly turning into a regular subject of conversation among the settlers. In a place where daily life revolved around chopping wood, tending animals, and preparing for winter, anything unusual quickly became a story worth repeating. And Maggie's decision to turn a cave into her home was certainly unusual. Each morning the valley woke to the same familiar sounds: axes chopping through frozen wood, wagon wheels creaking over hard soil, the distant lowing of cattle waiting to be fed. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys of half-finished cabins as families tested their fireplaces and cooked simple breakfasts before beginning another long day of work. Life here demanded routine and discipline. Everyone understood that survival depended on careful preparation. A poorly built roof could collapse under heavy snow. A weak chimney could fill a cabin with smoke. Even a small crack between logs might allow icy winds to creep inside during the coldest nights. Because of that, settlers trusted methods that had already proven themselves: log cabins, stone chimneys, thick roofs packed with moss and earth. These were the traditions carried west by generations of pioneers. So when Maggie Hale chose something completely different, it unsettled people more than they liked to admit. At first, most neighbors simply laughed about it. The first real wave of mockery began at the trading post near the creek. It was the closest thing the valley had to a gathering place, a rough wooden building stocked with flour, salt, tools, and other essentials. On most evenings, a few settlers would drift inside after finishing their work, warming their hands near the small iron stove while trading news and stories. One chilly evening in late October, the topic returned once again. Daniel Brooks leaned against the counter, sipping coffee from a dented tin cup. "You ride past the hill today?" he asked the shopkeeper. The old man nodded. "She's still at it?" Daniel chuckled. "Still digging around that cave like she is building a palace." A farmer named Eli Turner shook his head from a nearby stool. "I give her 2 weeks after the first snow," he said. 2 weeks? Daniel replied. "You are generous." The small group laughed. Another man spoke up from the doorway. "You know what caves are full of." "What?" "Cold air." The comment drew another round of chuckles. "Cold air and damp rock," Eli added. "Nothing else." Someone else muttered, "Maybe she plans to sleep like a bear." The jokes continued, bouncing easily from one person to another. But beneath the humor there was also confusion. The settlers simply could understand why someone would choose a cave over a cabin when timber stood plentiful just a short distance away. From their perspective, Maggie was ignoring the most obvious solution. A few neighbors tried to give her advice directly. One afternoon, Thomas Carter rode up the hillside again, guiding his horse carefully between loose stones. He had finished stacking the final logs of his own cabin, and felt relieved knowing his family would soon have solid walls before winter arrived. When he reached the cave entrance, he saw Maggie hauling a bundle of branches toward the opening. "Afternoon," he called. She looked up and nodded. Thomas studied the cave again. The entrance was wider now than it had been weeks earlier. Some of the brush had been cleared away, and a rough pile of stones rested nearby, as if waiting to be used for something. Still, it looked nothing like a proper home. "You ever change your mind about cutting logs?" he asked. Maggie wiped dirt from her hands. "No." Thomas sighed. "You know winter here gets mean," he said. Wind cut straight through rock faces. She did, T argue. She simply listened. "You d still have time." He continued, "I've got spare timber. Could help you raise a cabin in a few days if you started now." It was a generous offer, and he meant it. Out on the frontier, neighbors often helped one another build homes because everyone understood that someday they might need the same help in return. Maggie appreciated the gesture, but she shook her head gently. "I'll be fine." Thomas looked at the cave again, clearly unconvinced. "You sure about that?" "Yes." Her calm confidence made the conversation awkward. After a moment, he tipped his hat and climbed back onto his horse. "Well, dawn, say nobody offered." As he rode away, he glanced back once more at the dark opening in the hillside. To him it still looked like nothing more than a hollow in the rock. Not a home, not a shelter. Certainly not something that could withstand the brutal winter winds sweeping down from the northern plains. Over the next week, the teasing grew louder. Some of it happened openly when people passed Maggie on the road. One afternoon, 2 young men hauling firewood slowed their wagon near the hillside. "You digging yourself? A tunnel in there." one of them called jokingly. Maggie kept stacking stones and did T answer. Maybe she's building a mine, the other said with a grin. Hope she finds gold before the snow hits. They laughed and snapped the reins, urging their horses forward. Even children began repeating the jokes they heard from their parents. A group of boys wandering the hills spotted Maggie carrying buckets of gravel toward the cave. One of them shouted, "Careful! A bear might already live in there." The others burst into laughter before running off. Maggie watched them disappear over the ridge. She did to look angry, but she did to smile either. Instead, she returned quietly to her work. Despite the teasing, curiosity about the cave continued to grow. Some settlers could resist stopping to take a closer look. They would step near the entrance, peer inside the dim chamber, and then walk away shaking their heads. Inside the cave, the air felt cooler than the afternoon sun outside, but strangely steady. The stone walls muffled the wind, creating a silence that felt different from the open valley. But most visitors never stayed long enough to notice that. They simply saw dark rock and dirt. Nothing impressive, nothing comfortable, and certainly nothing worth choosing over a wooden cabin. Back at the trading post, the stories about Maggie became more exaggerated with every retelling. One man claimed she was digging deeper into the hillside. Another swore she planned to seal the entrance completely. A third joked that she might be hiding from winter underground like a prairie dog. Laughter followed nearly every version of the story. Yet a few settlers began to feel uneasy about the situation, not because they thought Maggie was dangerous, but because winter was coming quickly. The first real frost arrived early one morning, coating the valley in shimmering white crystals. Grass snapped underfoot like brittle glass. Water buckets left outside developed thin sheets of ice along their edges. Everyone understood what that meant. The cold season was no longer approaching. It had arrived. Cabin construction rushed into its final stages. Roof beams were lifted into place. Chimneys were packed with clay and stone. Firewood stacks grew taller beside every home. But Maggie still had no cabin. From a distance, the hillside looked nearly the same as it had weeks earlier. A cave. A wagon. A few piles of stone. When Daniel Brooks rode past one evening, he spotted Maggie near the entrance carrying a lantern. He stopped his horse and watched her disappear into the darkness. A moment later, the lantern glow flickered deeper inside the cave. Daniel frowned slightly. He had spent years building houses across the frontier, and the idea of someone trusting a natural cave instead of solid carpentry simply did make sense to him. Rock walls might look sturdy, but they were unpredictable. Moisture could seep through cracks. Cold air might settle inside like a trapped pool of ice. And if heavy snow drifted across the entrance, a person might find themselves sealed inside without warning. He shook his head slowly. "She's going to regret that," he muttered to himself. Still, Maggie showed no signs of regret. Day after day, she continued shaping the cave interior, hauling materials, adjusting the entrance, and studying the flow of air and light through the chamber. Sometimes neighbors passing by noticed small changes. A stack of flat stones arranged neatly near the entrance, branches leaning against the rock face. A narrow trench dug along the side of the cave wall. Each detail looked odd to outsiders, but to Maggie, every change served a purpose. Even while the laughter continued around the valley, she remained patient. She knew something the others did not yet understand. Caves had protected humans for thousands of years before the first wooden cabin was ever built. The earth itself was one of the strongest shelters nature could provide. Thick soil and stone blocked wind better than logs. Underground chambers resisted sudden temperature swings, and when properly prepared, they could hold warmth long after a fire had burned out. But explaining that to skeptical neighbors would have taken hours, and Maggie doubted they would believe her anyway. So she chose silence instead. Let them laugh. Let them shake their heads. Let them tell stories at the trading post about the strange woman living in a cave. Winter would arrive soon enough. And when it did, the truth of her strange idea would reveal itself far more clearly than words ever could. The valley settled into the deep quiet that always came just before winter truly arrived. The days grew shorter, and the sun traveled low across the sky, casting long shadows from the cottonwood trees along the creek. Frost lingered on the ground well into the late morning now, turning every blade of grass silver before melting into damp earth by midday. Most settlers had nearly finished preparing their homes. The sharp rhythm of axes had slowed, replaced by the softer sounds of stacking firewood, mending fences, and hauling supplies inside before the first real storm arrived. On the rocky hillside at the edge of the valley, however, the sound of work had not slowed at all. Maggie Hale continued her quiet labor at the cave. To anyone passing by, it might still have looked like she was simply digging and moving rocks. But if someone had taken the time to watch closely, they would have realized that the cave was slowly changing in careful, deliberate ways. Inside, Maggie moved with a lantern in one hand and a shovel in the other. The cave no longer looked like the rough hollow she had first discovered months earlier. The floor had been leveled with packed earth and gravel, creating a surface far more stable than the uneven stone beneath. Loose rocks had been cleared away from the walls, and the entrance area had been widened just enough to allow easier movement of supplies. But those were only the most visible changes. The real work, the work that mattered most, was happening quietly and gradually, piece by piece. Every morning Maggie studied the cave before she began working. She would stand just inside the entrance, feeling the air against her face. The breeze that drifted through the valley often carried sharp cold now, but the cave interior remained surprisingly calm. The deeper she walked inside, the more the outside world seemed to fade away. The stone walls absorbed sound. Even the wind that rattled through dry grass outside became nothing more than a faint whisper within the cave. It was in those quiet moments that Maggie focused on what mattered most: air, warmth, and control of both. She had learned long ago that shelter wasn't only about walls. A building could have thick timber and a sturdy roof, yet still fail if the air moved the wrong way. Cold wind slipping through cracks could steal heat faster than any fire could replace it. Many settlers believed that more firewood was the answer to winter. Maggie believed something different. Control the air, and the heat would stay. The cave already provided the most difficult part: thick natural insulation. The stone walls extended deep into the hillside, surrounded by layers of packed earth. That mass of rock and soil resisted sudden changes in temperature. Even when the air outside dropped sharply at night, the cave interior remained close to the steady temperature of the ground. But the entrance was still a weakness. Cold air could flow inside easily, especially during strong winds. So Maggie began working on the first major improvement. She started by gathering large stones from the hillside and hauling them toward the cave entrance using a small wooden sled tied to her mule. The rocks were heavy, some nearly the size of small barrels, but she moved them slowly, one at a time. At first, the neighbors who happened to pass by thought she was simply piling them randomly. But Maggie had a clear plan. Just inside the cave entrance, she began stacking the stones into a short, curved wall that rose to about waist height. It did not block the entrance completely. Instead, it formed a partial barrier, forcing anyone entering the cave to walk around it. The design seemed strange at first glance. Why build a wall that didn't fully close the opening? But Maggie understood something the others did not. Cold air behaved differently from warm air. Cold air was heavier. It sank and flowed along the ground like invisible water. By forcing incoming air to turn and move around the stone barrier, she slowed that flow. Instead of rushing directly into the cave, the cold air lost its momentum. Meanwhile, the warmer air deeper inside the cave would remain trapped above the barrier. It was a simple idea, but it could make a powerful difference once winter truly arrived. Once the barrier was finished, Maggie turned her attention to the ceiling. The cave's natural roof curved gently upward, forming a rough dome of limestone and compacted earth. In some places, the stone surface was smooth, but in others, small cracks and crevices allowed tiny drafts to slip through. Most settlers would never have noticed those openings, but Maggie did. Over several days, she mixed clay soil with water from the creek, creating a thick mud paste. Using a wooden paddle, she carefully pressed the mixture into the cracks along the cave walls and ceiling. It was slow, messy work. Sometimes the mud dripped onto her sleeves or splattered across the floor, but gradually the tiny gaps disappeared beneath layers of packed clay. As the clay dried, it hardened into a natural seal. Not perfect, but strong enough to reduce unwanted air movement. After sealing the walls, Maggie began working on something far more ambitious: ventilation. Most cabins relied on a simple chimney to pull smoke out of the building. The rising heat of the fire naturally drew air upward through the flue, carrying smoke away while pulling fresh air inside through cracks in the walls. But a cave had no chimney. Without proper airflow, smoke from a fire could quickly fill the chamber. So Maggie needed a different solution. Behind the cave, the hillside rose steeply. The thick earth and rock above the chamber extended several feet upward before reaching the open air. Maggie studied that slope for nearly an entire afternoon before she began digging. Using a pickaxe borrowed from a nearby miner, she started carving a narrow shaft upward through the packed soil behind the cave. The work was exhausting. Each strike of the pick loosened only small chunks of dirt and stone. Sometimes she had to pause to clear debris from the hole before continuing. Hour after hour, she chipped away at the earth. Day after day, the shaft grew deeper. From inside the cave, the opening looked like a narrow tunnel rising toward the ceiling. From outside, nothing yet showed on the hillside. Several neighbors passed by during those days and noticed Maggie hauling buckets of soil away from the cave entrance. One man stopped and called out, "You're digging a well in there." Maggie smiled faintly but did answer. The truth was far more interesting. After nearly a week of steady digging, Maggie finally broke through to the surface above the cave. Fresh daylight poured down through the narrow shaft. She stepped back, breathing hard, and looked up at the pale sky visible through the opening. The ventilation shaft was complete, but it still needed protection. If left open, rainwater or snow could fall directly into the cave. So Maggie gathered several flat stones and built a small stone collar around the surface opening outside. Then she covered it with a simple wooden hood angled downward, leaving enough space beneath it for air to pass through while keeping precipitation out. Inside the cave, the shaft worked exactly as she hoped. When she lit a small test fire near the stone hearth she had built earlier, smoke slowly began drifting upward toward the ceiling. Within minutes it found the shaft and slipped out through the opening above. Fresh air flowed gently inward through the cave entrance to replace it. The circulation was slow but steady. And best of all, it worked without letting strong winds blast directly inside. For the first time since beginning her project, Maggie allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The cave was beginning to breathe, but she wasn't finished yet. The next challenge involved the entrance itself. While the stone barrier helped slow incoming cold air, the cave opening remained exposed to the outside elements. Strong winds sweeping across the hillside could still push freezing air into the chamber. To solve that problem, Maggie began collecting thick branches and saplings from the nearby forest. She cut them into equal lengths and carried them back to the cave using her mule. Then she built a sturdy wooden frame just outside the entrance. The frame supported layers of woven brush, grass, and mud, forming a heavy natural door that could swing open when needed but remain closed during storms. It was not a perfect door, but it was thick, dense, and surprisingly effective at blocking wind. When closed, the brush-pack barrier acted like insulation, trapping air within its layers. By the time Maggie finished reinforcing the entrance, the cave felt dramatically different inside. Even during cold mornings when frost covered the valley, the cave interior remained calm and steady. The temperature never dropped as sharply as the outside air. The stone walls held the memory of warmer days. Meanwhile, the ventilation shaft quietly pulled smoke upward whenever Maggie tested her small fire. Every change she made brought the cave closer to becoming what she envisioned: a natural bunker, a shelter that used the earth itself as protection. From the outside, however, the neighbors still saw very little of this progress. They noticed Maggie hauling materials, digging and stacking stones, but they could not see the careful planning inside the cave. They did not understand the airflow, the insulation, or the hidden warmth stored within the hillside. To them, it still looked like a strange project that would likely fail once the first blizzard arrived. Yet Maggie continued working with calm determination. She knew that winter was approaching quickly now, and when it finally came, the cave would face its first true test. But as she stood inside the chamber one quiet evening, lantern light glowing softly against the stone walls, Maggie felt something stronger than doubt. She felt certainty. The cave was ready. All it needed now was winter. By the time the first true breath of winter reached the valley, the entire landscape had begun to change. Autumn-esque colors had long since faded into dull shades of brown and gray. The tall grasses that once waved in golden waves across the fields now stood stiff and brittle, coated each morning with a thin layer of frost that sparkled in the pale sunlight before slowly melting away. The air itself had grown sharper. People could feel the difference every time they stepped outside their cabins in the early hours. The wind carried a bite that reached through coats and gloves, and every breath left a faint cloud of steam in the cold air. For weeks the settlers had been preparing for this moment. Cabins stood finished across the valley now, their rough log walls darkened by weather and smoke. Stone chimneys rose above their roofs like watchful towers. Piles of firewood stacked beside each home promised warmth through the long nights ahead. Families had moved their supplies indoors. Barrels of salted meat, sacks of flour, dried vegetables, and bundles of herbs filled shelves and storage corners. Tools had been brought inside, animals sheltered in barns, and wagons pulled close to buildings to protect them from storms. Everyone understood that winter on the frontier was never gentle, but most believed they were ready. High above the valley floor, on the rocky hillside, Maggie Hale watched the same changing season with a quiet awareness. From the entrance of her cave, she could see nearly the entire valley stretching out beneath the pale sky. Smoke drifted slowly from the chimneys of the cabins below, thin gray lines twisting upward into the cold air. The view was peaceful. Yet Maggie knew that peace would not last long. The wind had already begun shifting directions more often, sweeping down from the north with increasing strength. Clouds moved faster across the sky now, their shapes heavy and gray, hinting at storms still gathering far beyond the distant hills. Winter was coming, and it was coming fast. The first snowfall arrived one evening just after sunset. At first the flakes drifted down gently, almost lazily, barely noticeable against the darkening sky. They floated through the cold air like scattered feathers, settling quietly on the frozen ground. But as the night deepened, the snow began falling harder. By morning the valley had transformed. A smooth white blanket covered everything. Fields, fences, rooftops, and wagon tracks had disappeared beneath a layer of fresh snow several inches deep. The creek that ran through the valley was beginning to freeze along its edges, thin sheets of ice spreading slowly across the surface. Children rushed outside to see the first snow, their laughter echoing between the cabins as they kicked through the powder. For a short while the valley felt almost joyful, but the older settlers watched the sky with more serious expressions. They had seen winters before, and they knew that the first snow was only the beginning. Over the next several days the temperature continued dropping. Morning frost grew thicker. Water left outside froze solid overnight. Even during the middle of the day, the sun struggled to warm the air above freezing. Inside their cabins, families began lighting fires more frequently. Smoke rose steadily from the chimneys across the valley as wood crackled and popped in fireplaces. The smell of burning pine drifted through the cold air, mixing with the faint scent of snow and frozen earth. Most settlers spent their days indoors now, repairing tools, cooking meals, or simply staying close to the warmth of their fires. But sometimes when the weather cleared for a few hours, a few curious neighbors still rode past the rocky hillside. They wanted to see whether Maggie Hale had finally changed her mind. Each time they arrived, they found the same sight. The cave entrance stood partially hidden behind its thick brush and wood door. A faint trail of footprints led between the cave and Maggie's wagon, which now stood parked beside a cluster of boulders nearby. No log cabin, no chimney, just the cave and Maggie. One afternoon Thomas Carter rode up the slope again, guiding his horse carefully through the snow. He had been meaning to check on Maggie for several days, but had been busy finishing repairs on his barn roof. When he reached the cave entrance, he called out, "Maggie!" The brush door shifted slightly as she stepped outside. She wore a thick wool coat and gloves, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Afternoon," she said calmly. Thomas looked around the hillside. "You staying warm enough up here?" "I am." He glanced at the cave entrance behind her, clearly uncertain. "You sure you done to need help building something before the storms get worse?" Maggie smiled faintly. "I am all set." Thomas rubbed his gloved hands together. "Well, if you change your mind, there. Still plenty of timber near the creek." "Thank you." He nodded once, then turned his horse back toward the valley. As he rode away, he could shake the uneasy feeling that Maggie was taking a dangerous gamble, because winter was only beginning to show its strength. The second snowfall arrived less than a week later. This one was heavier. Snow fell steadily throughout the day, thick flakes swirling in the wind and piling rapidly against fences and cabin walls. By evening, the drifts had already reached knee-height in some places. Travel across the valley became slow and difficult. Wagons struggled to push through the deep snow, and horses moved cautiously across the icy ground. Inside the cabins, families fed more wood into their fires, watching the flames dance behind iron grates, while the wind rattled against the walls outside. The temperature continued falling. Nighttime readings dropped far below freezing now, sometimes reaching levels that made even strong men hesitate before stepping outside. And then, one evening, the wind arrived. It began as a low howl across the open plains beyond the valley. Within hours, the sound grew louder, stronger, until it roared through the trees like a living thing. Snow lifted from the ground and spun through the air in swirling clouds. Branches creaked and snapped beneath the pressure of the wind. Across the valley, cabin doors slammed shut as families rushed indoors. Inside their homes, settlers pushed extra logs into their fireplaces, building larger fires to fight the growing cold. But even with thick walls and burning wood, the wind found ways to slip inside. Cold drafts crept through cracks between logs. Chimneys whistled as gusts forced air downward. Windows rattled in their frames as the storm intensified. For the first time that winter, many settlers began to worry, because the wind showed no sign of stopping. Hour after hour it battered the valley. Snow drifted into deep piles against cabin walls. Paths between buildings vanished beneath swirling white clouds. Even the barns groaned beneath the pressure of the storm. Some families woke during the night to feed their fires again, afraid that if the flames died, the cold might quickly follow. Outside, the storm raged across the valley like a relentless force. High on the hillside, snow piled around the cave entrance as well. But inside the cave, something very different was happening. The thick stone walls absorbed the sound of the wind, turning the violent roar outside into a distant, muffled hum. The brush door at the entrance blocked the worst of the gusts, while the stone barrier just inside slowed the flow of cold air creeping into the chamber. Deep within the cave, the temperature remained steady. Not warm like a roaring fireplace, but far calmer than the freezing chaos outside. Maggie sat near her small stone hearth, feeding a modest fire with short pieces of wood she had gathered earlier in the season. The flames flickered softly, their smoke rising slowly toward the ventilation shaft above before disappearing into the night sky. Fresh air drifted gently through the entrance, replacing the smoke without creating harsh drafts. The cave felt quiet, protected, safe. Outside, the blizzard continued through the night, burying the valley beneath drifting snow and freezing winds. Inside their cabins, settlers added more wood to their fires, fighting to keep the cold at bay. And though many of them remembered Maggie, strange cave shelter, most believed the storm would finally prove them right, because no cave, they thought, could stand against a winter like this. Yet while the valley battled the storm, Maggie remained inside her stone shelter, calm and patient, waiting for the long night to pass. The storm that had swept across the valley during the night did not leave quietly. When morning finally arrived, the sky remained a dull sheet of gray, and the wind still pushed restless clouds of snow across the frozen fields. The valley looked completely different from what it had been only 2 days earlier, where open ground and wagon paths once stretched between cabins. Thick drifts of snow now rose like frozen waves. Some drifts reached the height of a man's waist. Fence posts had nearly disappeared beneath white mounds. Barn doors were half buried, forcing farmers to dig narrow paths just to reach their animals. Even the creek had vanished beneath a crust of ice and snow, leaving only a faint depression in the landscape where the water once flowed freely. Inside the cabins, the settlers were already awake. Many had slept poorly during the night. The wind had howled so fiercely against the log walls that some families feared their roofs might tear loose. Every few hours, someone had risen from bed to feed the fire, pushing fresh logs into the flames while cold drafts crept along the floorboards. By morning, the fireplaces in nearly every cabin were burning steadily. Smoke drifted upward from chimneys across the valley, thin gray columns rising slowly into the heavy winter air. But despite the fires, many homes still felt cold. The storm had driven temperatures down further than anyone expected. Even with thick coats and wool blankets, the chill seemed to seep through walls and floors, settling deep into bones. In Thomas Carter's cabin, the fire crackled loudly in the stone hearth as he stood near the doorway pulling on his gloves. His wife watched him with concern. "You, Don, have to go out today," she said. The wind still strong. Thomas shook his head. "I just want to check the barn and make sure the roof held." He grabbed his hat and stepped outside. The cold air hit him immediately. It was the kind of cold that stole breath from the lungs and made eyes water within seconds. The wind had slowed since the worst of the storm, but it still carried a biting edge that cut through clothing. Thomas trudged through the deep snow toward the barn, each step sinking nearly to his knees. Across the valley he could see other settlers doing the same, digging paths, clearing doors, and checking on animals. The storm had been harsh, but the cabins had survived. Most people felt relieved. Yet as Thomas shoveled snow away from the barn entrance, something else crossed his mind. Maggie, the cave. He paused for a moment, leaning on his shovel. All winter people had joked about the strange woman living inside a hillside cave. Many believed the first serious storm would drive her back down into the valley to ask for help. But no one had seen her since the snow began falling. Thomas wiped frost from his beard and looked toward the rocky hill in the distance. The slope was nearly hidden beneath snow now, the cave entrance somewhere beneath drifting white shadows. For a moment he wondered if she had managed to stay warm, or if the cave had finally become the frozen trap everyone expected. By late morning, the wind had weakened enough for people to move around more easily. Several men gathered near the trading post after clearing paths between their homes. They stomped snow from their boots and warmed their hands near the iron stove inside. The storm quickly became the main topic of conversation. "That wind nearly ripped my chimney loose," one man said. "Same here," another replied. "Had to stuff blankets against the door to stop the draft." Someone else added, "Fire burned through half my woodpile last night." A few tired laughs followed. Winter storms always forced people to burn more firewood than expected. But then Daniel Brooks leaned back in his chair and said something that made the room fall briefly silent. "Anybody check on Maggie?" The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow. "You mean the cave lady?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah." A farmer standing near the door shrugged. "If she is smart, she came down to someone's cabin." Daniel shook his head slowly. I rode past the hill yesterday before the storm got bad. Didn't see any wagon tracks leaving. Another man chuckled. Well, maybe she's still digging in there. A few people laughed again, but the humor felt thinner this time, because the storm had been stronger than anyone expected, and even those who had mocked Maggie before were now wondering whether she might actually be in trouble. Thomas Carter stepped forward. I am riding up there after lunch, he said. You think she needs help? Someone asked. I don't know, Thomas replied. But I'd rather check than find out too late. By midday, the sky had begun clearing slightly. Pale sunlight filtered through thin clouds, casting a dull glow across the frozen valley. Thomas saddled his horse and wrapped a thick scarf around his face before beginning the slow ride toward the hillside. The snow made travel difficult. Drifts forced the horse to pick its way carefully along the slope, and more than once Thomas had to dismount to guide the animal through deeper patches. As he climbed higher, the wind grew quieter. The hillside itself provided some shelter from the open valley winds, but the snow had piled heavily here as well. Large drifts formed along the rock face where the cave entrance should have been. Thomas narrowed his eyes, searching the white hillside. For a moment he feared the storm might have buried the cave completely. Then he saw something unexpected. A thin trail of smoke. It drifted gently upward from the snow-covered slope, faint but unmistakable against the pale sky. Thomas frowned. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant warmth. He urged his horse forward, heart beating faster now. As he approached the cave, the details slowly came into view. The entrance had not been buried by snow. Instead, a narrow, cleared path led from the cave to the open hillside, as if someone had been regularly sweeping snow away. Above the cave, a small stone structure rose from the ground, the top of the ventilation shaft Maggie had built earlier in the season. From beneath its wooden cover, a faint thread of smoke escaped into the cold air. Thomas dismounted and stepped closer. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The cave had survived the storm. More than that, it appeared to be functioning exactly as Maggie had planned. The brush-covered door shifted slightly as he approached. Before he could knock, the door opened. Maggie stepped outside. She looked calm, not frozen, not exhausted, just calm. "Morning," she said. Thomas stared at her in disbelief. You were all right?" "Yes." He glanced past her toward the cave interior. Warm air drifted faintly outward through the doorway. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the bitter wind outside. "How cold did it get in there last night?" he asked. Maggie thought for a moment. "Stayed around 55 degrees warmer than outside," she replied. Thomas blinked. "That's impossible." She smiled slightly. "Not really." He stepped closer to the entrance, curiosity overcoming hesitation. "Mind if I take a look?" "Go ahead." Thomas ducked through the doorway and stepped inside. The difference hit him immediately. The cave air felt calm and steady. There were no sharp drafts, no icy gusts crawling across the floor. A small fire burned quietly in the stone hearth near the back wall, its flames flickering softly beneath the ventilation shaft. Smoke rose slowly upward and disappeared through the narrow opening above. The stone barrier near the entrance blocked much of the cold air trying to creep inside, and the thick rock walls surrounding the chamber held a gentle, stable warmth. Thomas removed his gloves slowly, still stunned. Outside, the valley remained locked in winter, as grip. Inside the cave, the air felt almost comfortable. He turned toward Maggie. "Good Lord," he muttered. She simply shrugged. "The earth does most of the work." Thomas stepped back outside after a few minutes, shaking his head in amazement. The cave behind him no longer looked like a foolish idea. It looked like something far more impressive, something clever, something most of the valley had completely misunderstood, and he knew the others would want to hear about it, because the woman they had laughed at all autumn had just proven them wrong. Word of what Thomas Carter had seen on the hillside spread through the valley faster than anyone expected. By the time the sun dipped behind the distant hills that evening, nearly everyone had heard the same astonishing story. Maggie Hale was still living in the cave, and somehow, despite the brutal winter storm that had shaken every cabin in the valley, the inside of that cave had stayed far warmer than the frozen air outside. At first, many people didn't believe it. Frontier settlements were full of exaggerations. A simple story could grow into something unbelievable after passing through enough conversations. Some settlers assumed Thomas must have misunderstood what he felt inside the cave. Others thought perhaps the fire Maggie kept burning inside had simply warmed the chamber for a short time. But Thomas was not known for telling wild stories. He had built cabins across 3 territories. He understood cold weather better than most men in the valley. If he said something strange was happening inside that cave, people listened. Still, curiosity demanded proof. The next morning, several men saddled their horses and began the slow ride toward the rocky hillside. Snow still carved the valley in deep drifts, but the sky had cleared, revealing a cold blue morning that seemed almost peaceful after the storm. Among the riders were Daniel Brooks, Eli Turner, and two other farmers from the far end of the valley. None of them spoke much during the ride. Part of them expected to arrive and discover that Thomas had exaggerated the story. Maybe the cave was slightly warmer than outside, but nothing remarkable. Maybe the storm had simply sheltered the hillside from the worst wind, but deep down they were curious. Because if Thomas was right, it meant something they had all laughed at might actually be smart. The climb up the hillside was slow. Snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves as the men guided them along narrow paths between exposed rocks. The wind had settled overnight, leaving the air eerily still. As they approached the slope where Maggie's cave was hidden, Daniel noticed something first. "Look," he said quietly. A faint ribbon of smoke drifted upward against the pale sky, not from a chimney, from the small stone hood above the ventilation shaft Maggie had built. Eli squinted at it. "I'll be damned," he muttered. They rode closer until the cave entrance came into view. Just as Thomas had described, a narrow path had been cleared through the snow leading to the door. The brush-covered entrance looked sturdy, packed thick with woven branches and earth. This time the men dismounted without joking. The teasing they had once shared about the cave felt different now. Daniel stepped forward and knocked lightly against the wooden frame. A moment later the door opened. Maggie stood there calmly, wearing the same quiet expression she always seemed to carry. "Well," Daniel said awkwardly, "heard we might come take a look." "You were welcome to," Maggie replied. One by one the men stepped inside, and one by one their expressions changed. The cave did not feel like the frozen stone chamber they had imagined all autumn. The air was steady. Gentle warmth lingered inside the thick walls. Not the intense heat of a roaring cabin fireplace, but a calm, comfortable warmth that wrapped around them without any sharp drafts. Eli slowly removed his gloves. "How?" he began. Maggie simply gestured toward the stone walls. "The hill keeps the cold out," she said. Daniel looked around carefully. He noticed the stone barrier near the entrance forcing air to bend before reaching the interior. He noticed the packed clay sealing cracks in the rock. He noticed the small fire burning quietly beneath the ventilation shaft, sending smoke upward in a steady, controlled stream. Everything had been planned. Nothing about the cave felt accidental. "Fees warmer than my cabin," one of the farmers admitted. Another man walked deeper inside, placing a hand against the stone wall. "It is the earth," he murmured. Maggie nodded. "The ground holds its temperature. Doesn't change as fast as the air." Daniel scratched his beard thoughtfully. "So all winter it'll stay like this?" "Pretty close." The men exchanged glances. A few months earlier they had laughed at this very place. Now they were standing inside it, trying to understand how they had been so wrong. After a while the group stepped back outside into the cold sunlight. The difference in temperature hit them immediately. Wind brushed across the hillside, sending a sharp chill through their coats. Eli shivered. "Feels like walking out of spring into winter," he said. Daniel stared back at the cave entrance quietly. "You knew this would work," he said to Maggie. She shrugged slightly. "I hoped." By the time the men returned to the valley, the story had grown even stronger. Now it was just that Maggie's cave had survived the storm. It was that the cave had stayed warmer than the cabins. That detail fascinated everyone. Over the following days, more settlers made the trip to the hillside themselves. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of skepticism, convinced the earlier visitors must have exaggerated. But every visitor experienced the same surprise. The cave truly was warmer. Not by a small margin either. While the valley shivered in bitter cold, Maggie's shelter remained calm and steady inside the earth. Even the wind that rattled cabin doors across the valley barely reached the cave interior. Gradually the laughter that had followed Maggie for months disappeared. People no longer joked about the woman living in a hole in the hillside. Instead, they began asking questions. How deep did the cave go? How did the air move through it? Could other shelters be built the same way? Even Thomas Carter found himself studying the hillside more carefully now, whenever he rode past. One afternoon he visited Maggie again, carrying a small sack of dried apples as a gift. "You changed a lot of minds around here," he said as he handed her the bag. She smiled politely. "I didn't mean to." Thomas looked around the cave once more. "You might not have meant to, but you did." He paused before adding something else. "Some folks are talking about trying something similar next year." Maggie chuckled softly. "People always laugh at strange ideas first." Thomas nodded. that they do. Winter continued tightening its grip on the valley as the weeks passed. More storms arrived. More snow buried the fields. Cabin fires burned day and night as families fought to stay warm through the longest nights of the year. But high on the hillside, Maggie's cave remained steady. The thick earth walls held their quiet warmth. The ventilation shaft breathed slowly with each small fire. And the natural bunker continued doing exactly what Maggie had trusted it to do: protect. Eventually, the story of the cave spread beyond the valley. Travelers passing through during the winter months heard the tale from settlers at the trading post. Some dismissed it as another frontier exaggeration, but others rode up the hillside themselves just to see. And every time someone stepped inside that cave for the first time, they felt the same surprising warmth, the same quiet comfort, the same realization. Sometimes the smartest ideas did to look impressive from the outside. Sometimes they looked strange, even foolish. But every now and then, those strange ideas turned out to be the ones that worked best of all. And long after the laughter faded from memory, the cave on the hillside remained a reminder that wisdom did to always follow the crowd. Sometimes it carved its own path straight into the earth itself.